Welcome back to the channel. In another video I've posted that I've linked below, I refinished the wheels of my 2004 Dodge Viper and turned them from this into this with the power of movie magic in 26 minutes. But what we'll be discussing today is why you shouldn't attempt a project like this on your own and everything that went wrong that I didn't necessarily show in that video. So let's get started. First things first is this is a very time-consuming project. I had more than 80 hours of labor into this, and that doesn't include things like the times that the wheels were sitting to remove the clear coat as the paint stripper was doing its thing. Even from a film perspective, after I changed all the time lapses into condensed videos, I had over 8 hours of footage to go through to make that one video. With the condensed time lapses, it was 135 gigabytes of video at 1080p resolution. Before I condensed the time lapses, it was over 200 gigabytes of footage. And in total, it took about 3 months for me to finish this project. Now, part of that is I started this over the winter and I had to wait for good weather to actually spray it. So some of it was just downtime waiting for decent weather or warm days. But keep in mind, this is time that the wheels will not be on the car. So if it's your only set of wheels, that means you cannot drive the car as long as you're doing this project. To be fair though, I did say repeatedly in that video that I was being an absolute perfectionist with these wheels because I want to keep this car forever. So I wanted these to be absolutely immaculate. So I probably could have done a half decent job and done it in a much lower amount of time. But like I said, I wanted these to be perfect, so it was a little more time consuming as a result of that. Next is that this is a very tedious thing to do because a lot of it has to be done by hand. With the number of contours on the spokes, with the fact that you don't really have any flat surfaces, with the fact that it's a wheel, so it's obviously round, it's not easy to get power tools in there to sand it. So most of the sanding has to be done by hand to really get a good job. And the same thing goes after you Bondo fill any defects. You have to hand sand it afterwards as well for the most part, which makes it not only time consuming but extremely detail oriented for hours on end. This means that there's going to be some stupid detail you might miss, but you won't really be able to see it while it's dusty until you get that final glossy paint on, and then it's going to be really obvious in the fresh coat of paint. And that did happen to me on 1 or 2 areas when I did this, so I ended up having to restrip the wheels and then fade in that section after I refinished it properly in that local area. Next is that when I started sanding these and I was getting a bunch of the really rough curb rash out, I did that in the basement of my house. And what I didn't think about, because I haven't done a project like this before, is not only did it cover everything in my basement with a nice layer of metallic dust, it also went in through my furnace and then kind of blew a little metallic dust throughout my house for the next week. If you have the option, do not do it inside. The next problem I encountered is that the citrus strip is absolutely not up to the job for removing the enamel clear coat from these wheels. I said this in the main video too. I think I went through a whole bottle of the citrus strip with very limited results before I switched to the more aggressive Jasco paint and epoxy remover, and that took off everything within 1 to 2 coats. Don't waste your time with the citrus strip. Go straight for the aggressive stuff. It will save you a lot of time and a lot of effort in the end. However, it does have some odor, and just like the metallic dust, that odor spread throughout my house as well. It didn't linger for a super long time, but I could smell it throughout the house for probably about 10 to 12 hours, and I could still smell it within different regions of my basement for the next couple days. It wasn't super potent that whole time, but it was noticeable. Once again, just doing the project outside would completely resolve this issue. The next problem I encountered is mostly my fault, but I'm going to try to point my finger at the citrus strip simply because it's more fun to have a scapegoat. When I was initially using the citrus strip, I used a bunch of metal scraping tools because I noticed the clear coat wasn't coming off. The problem being that I was working my way through the clear coat not because the citrus strip was working, but because the tools were just digging in enough, which means they also dug into the polished aluminum face underneath. Now, most modern car wheels are made from aluminum, and it is a very soft metal, so if you're doing this at home, stick to the plastic razor blades. You will damage the faces and make them worse and make your job more difficult if you try to use metal tools and metal scrapers, because like me, you will cut into the faces. Which brings me to painting, and everything about painting these, which is pretty much the bulk of the project other than the prep work, sucked. It was miserable and it was a problem from start to finish. And when I say every part of it, I mean every part of it. So let's start with how wheel paints are hard to find, or if it is a wheel specific paint, it's relatively expensive. Wheels are obviously exposed to some of the harshest conditions. They have the highest temperature changes because they go from the really cold environment to getting very hot with all the road friction. They also have to deal with the brake dust. They are obviously in the sun a good amount of time. So having a durable enough paint is very difficult to come by, but the cans that are marked as specific wheel paints were something like $20 a can when I was looking. And part of that is because of COVID pricing and supply chain issues, but manufacturers know that if a finish is tested and is durable enough to be labeled as a wheel-specific paint, they can charge more for it because it had to do that additional development to prove it was worthy. Even so, some of the paints I found that were quote-unquote wheel paints, specifically the primer, were garbage. The adhesion was terrible. It did not stick to the metal, even though the metal was pretty much perfectly prepped and cleaned. And the second I went to a different primer, I didn't have any of those issues. So yes, the adhesion of something that's only job is to promote adhesion was terrible, and it screwed me over, and it created peeling issues not only up front, but also at the very end of the project when I removed the masking. The green primer that I used removed chunks on the inside of the wheel as well when I thought I was done with the project. Furthermore, I just don't think people order wheel paints as often. It's just not as common of a thing to do relative to painting like a house or something else. So I think these sit in a shelf or in a warehouse or wherever they're in storage for a longer period of time. The reason I bring this up is one of the cans of primer I had, and again, it was this wheel specific green primer, came out a little bit chunky, almost like a silly stringy type texture, even though I did a very thorough job mixing the absolute crap out of it. And the problem was it gave just a little bit of texture that didn't look too bad when you had that flat primer finish, but the second there was a gloss coat over the top with the bronze, it looked atrocious in every single little dimple and bump that was in it. All the little contaminants or chunks were super visible. I only had this issue with one can, but even so, I had to completely redo at least one wheel because of this one can. And that's in addition to eating the cost of the paint, because you can't really return a used can of paint. Full disclosure is I was having a total head injury moment too when I was first doing the primer coating. I did not do a thick enough coating of the base primer. And I think my justification for it at the time was that I was trying to use less to save a little cost, but it ended up costing me a lot more money because it means it took a lot more of the top coats of bronze to get the same level of coverage that I otherwise would have had. Now it didn't matter anyway because the paint kept peeling, so I ended up having to redo it with a different primer anyhow, but make sure you get a good healthy coating of the primer. It will give you a much better finished product, assuming of course that your primer isn't absolute garbage. Another issue that you couldn't see until you did the final layer of the gloss paint is that by not having a controlled environment, I was picking up things like dust or blades of grass or whatever the wind just happened to be blowing, and it wasn't much and it wasn't big, and again, I was just going for complete perfection, which is why I noticed it, but I would get these little tiny flakes of debris and nature that just stuck in the paint because I was doing this outside. But I couldn't do this in my basement either because, like I figured out when I did the sanding, it would blow the paint through the entire house if it got into my HVAC system. As I mentioned in the other video, every time there was something in the paint or there was a defect or there was some sort of an issue, you can't rework it while the paint is wet. That means you have to wait for it to fully dry and then pick out whatever is there or sand it out or do whatever you're doing to spray over it. You have to do that after it is fully cured. So one time I got a little bit of a run and I think I went to dab it up and it made this extremely horrible looking texture on the face. But even when there was something like a hair that fell into the paint, you couldn't really pick it out without creating a bigger problem that you'd have to fix later on. Compounding this issue is the fact that wheels are just straight up difficult to paint, especially these wheels because they're so freaking wide. Normally when you have a set of wheels and you're spraying down into the barrels, they're not 13 inches deep, so you can get a relatively good angle on them by holding the can upright, but the angle you'd have to get to spray the bottom of the barrel, specifically on these wheels, was just so extreme that it would literally cut off the flow of the paint. Kind of like when you spray a can when it's upside down. It's the same thing where you're no longer actually blowing out paint, you're just kind of blowing out compressed air. I tried to overcome this by standing the wheels upright on the tire and then slowly rolling them as I sprayed the inside. I think that was probably the best way I figured out to do this, but even so, it was an imperfect solution. But wheels this deep are extremely hard to paint on the inside, and then the spokes of wheels in general, because there's so many angle changes and because you have so many different surfaces that mate together, it's just an extremely hard thing to paint and get a consistent good finish across. This is far from my first spray painting project. Even so, I still got a decent number of runs, and every time I did, I had to go back and rework it and reblend everything in. And fortunately, working from the same can, I wasn't having to match colors, but even so, blending in two different regions with different coverage is not an easy thing to do, especially on a surface like this. For me, this issue was most prevalent on the clear coat. Truth be told, I have issues spraying clear coats in general just because I can't physically see it as well. But that said, the wheel specific specific clear coat was also more runny than the other clear coats I've worked with previously. So when you combine that it was more runny, that I have difficulty seeing it, and that this is one of the most difficult shaped objects you can paint, and that you do have a bunch of different surfaces at different depths at all times that you're trying to hit, I had more runs in this project than any other project I've had, including doing motorcycle fairings. And it's not to say that all of the runs were super bad and they were everywhere, but they were definitely noticeable enough that I went back and I fixed them, even the ones on the inside of the wheel, because like I said, I wanted absolute perfection on these. So due to the size of the wheels, but then also the amount of rework that I had to do to remove these imperfections, to refade things, and then to repair all the areas that peeled up of the primer, I used probably twice, not quite 2.5 times the amount of paint I initially planned on using. I thought I was going to use roughly $60 to $80 worth of paint. I probably used closer to $150 to $200 of paint by the time it was actually done. Then when you add in all the other materials and tools that I use, so for example the plastic razor blades, but also the Bondo, the sandpaper, the isopropyl alcohol to clean everything up, the distilled water, my total cost was a little bit under $250, which is still way cheaper than buying a $7,000 set of wheels for this car, but $250 is a lot more than I thought this project was initially going to cost me. That said, the quotes I got for a professional to redo these wheels were $1,200 to $1,400 on the cheaper end, mostly due to the size and how bad the condition was. So at the end of the day, the $250 was more than I thought, but I really can't complain given the perspective of how much it was going to cost me otherwise. And the final issue that I had that caused me to redo a significant amount of work is that when I was pressure washing these to clean them off, I went to move the pressure washer and I believe the wind caught the tire, but either way it started rolling and it fell onto my concrete patio, but it fell face down and it damaged and scratched and chipped pretty much the entire face. I had to legitimately redo the entire face of this wheel from the start, and that absolutely killed me. Here's the original audio clip and you can just hear how disappointed and frustrated I was with this.
Oh, that kills me. That absolutely kills me. That is just crap luck. That is frustrating. Very frustrating.
Now, this isn't to say you're guaranteed to drop your wheels on their faces and it's going to cause you to restart, but realize that if you're not extremely careful when you're handling these at any point during the project, damage like this can happen, and if it does, it's going to put you in a really difficult spot and you are going to be kicking yourself for quite a while about it. Another risk to consider is that because I was trying to do this on a budget, I did not take the tires off of the rims. It would have made things a lot easier, but it also runs the risk, especially with tires of this size, that the wheels could get re-damaged when the tires are being remounted. So for those two reasons, I left the tires on during this project. That said, you are using paint, you are using cleaners, you are using paint stripper. If you are not careful, that will get on your tires and it could degrade your tires, it could dry them out, it could potentially cause issues for you down the road. Now, I was super careful with the paint thinner. I was extremely certain that I did not get any chemicals on these tires, and like I said, these tires are something like $2,000 for a set. So I was paranoid about keeping them well masked at all times. But something to keep in mind is that if you're not quite as diligent, there is the risk that you could degrade your tires. Now, if you're replacing them anyway, not a huge deal, but especially if you have a set like this, just keep that in mind and be careful. And probably the final issue, and this was actually a way bigger issue than I thought it would be, was painting the center caps. Now, this doesn't seem like it should be so difficult considering they're so small relative to the rest of the wheel, but oh my god, I had so much difficulty filling in the Viper logo and getting it to be perfect. Now, I'm planning an entire separate video on just the center caps. If and when that's ever posted, I will link that in the description below. But I tried so many different techniques. I had many failures before I had success with getting the center caps done. I think I repainted the center caps 5 or 6 times before they came out good enough that I was happy with them, which means I restripped them down to bare metal 5 or 6 times and then resprayed them from primer up. Like I said, I'm going to do a whole video on kind of the trials and tribulations of that, but just know that that was a freaking struggle. Now, with all this in mind, a lot of this was a learning curve because it's the first time I've done a set of wheels like this, especially of this size, and this is not an easy project, and I knew that going into this. That said, the prep work I did inside that made a mess and stunk up the house, that's easily avoidable by going outside. A lot of the waiting time I had, that would have been easily avoidable by waiting till a better part of the year, or if I had a heated garage or workshop to work in. The tires falling on their face. You could argue I wasn't paying attention and I didn't make sure the tire was secured before I walked away. So a lot of these things, you can chalk them up to me not knowing what to do here because I hadn't done this before, into there being a definitive learning curve on doing this for the first time. And obviously, like I said, trying to be an absolute perfectionist on a set of wheels made this a lot more time consuming than it probably needed to be. The reality is, not many people are ever going to look at your wheels that closely, especially if the car is not going to be a show car. But even if they do, they're probably not going to look 5 to 10 inches on the inside of the wheel barrels. They're not going to be crawling under a car, especially one as low as the Viper, where you've got 4 to 5 inches of ground clearance, to look on the inside edge of the lips, right? So I was absolutely going overkill on this project, and I know that, but in the back of my mind, I know it was always going to bother me if I didn't have it perfect because I was going to know where the defects were. But the reality is, no one that will ever encroach this car will approach it with the same level of criticism that I would have used on this car every single day. So it was more to make myself happy than to make anyone else happy. So you could shave a lot of the time down by just doing a less perfect job, is really what it comes down to. But the big question is, in the end, was all of this worth it? Especially to try to get it as perfect as I did. Was it really worth the extra effort and the extra cost to go the extra mile? And for me, the answer is a resounding yes. Not even a question. I would do it again in a heartbeat. Because beyond the wheels just being in such a better condition than they were before, knowing that they're absolutely perfect and having not only the pride of this being my dream car and knowing that I've worked so hard to get it, but also having the pride of knowing that I got it to the condition it's in myself and that I made these wheels as perfect as I did on my own. For me, there's a real sense of enjoyment in that, and it's a level of pride that, quite frankly, I don't think you can replicate unless you've worked so hard to get something like this, and that I think a lot of the other supercar owners simply don't have if this is just throwaway money to buy something like this, right? For me, the level of pride that I have in this work and how amazing I think it came out in the end far outweighs all of these grievances that I had with doing this. I want to be clear that this is one of the most strenuously pain in the butt projects I have done in quite some time. But the second I put those wheels on the car, oh my God. Oh my God. Especially when I rolled it out into the sunlight for the first time, made the hair stand up on my neck because it was worth every second of effort, every sleepless night, and every single gray hair, of which I got several from this project. And with that, I'm going to close this one out. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.